Hey guys, what's up? It's Samantha, and I'm back with a plan with me, and I'm being ambitious here. I'm going to try to memory keep from where I left off. So we are doing the first week in July. You know, it was a while ago, and last year I never memory kept July through December because I got so far behind from being sick, and I want to use these kits. So a lot of these kits you'll see are a year and a half, 2.5 years old at this point because I had a whole half year of memory keeping kits pretty much that I never used, and I wanted to use them. So I am going to go over all of the books that I read this week. I will say this week and probably for the next 4, 5, 6 weeks that I'm planning in here, I guess, or talking about the books that I read, I was in such a reading slump after I finished Battleground, the 17th book in the Dresden Files. I had an arc and I couldn't talk about it with anyone, which was really hard because I was emotionally devastated by that book. I normally don't get bad book hangovers or a feeling of what now after I finish a book. I know that's something I've heard people talk about in the bookish community, and that rarely happens to me. And maybe sometimes I won't read something for the rest of the day if I finish a book that's really resonating with me. I cried so much. I think I talked about this in my previous thing. I cried so much over this stupid book, and then I just couldn't get into anything. I felt just emotionally devastated by a book, and it was so hard. So I did not read very much in the weeks after Battleground, but I did finish 3 books during this week. So I'm going to talk about those. And before I jump into the books, I do want to say with this spread, I tried something different. I tried putting down all of the labels and half boxes and that sort of thing before I did the icons. I don't know how I feel about that. So this is formatted a little differently. You'll see after I'm done putting down the spread that it's a little different than I normally do it. I think I went back to doing it my normal way in the other videos, but yeah, I'm going to go ahead and jump into talking about the books that I read this week. So the first book that I finished was The Empire of Gold by S.A. Chakraborty, and I did have an arc of this, and I read it very slowly because I didn't want this series to be over. I think this might have compounded my book hangover problems because I finished Battleground, and then the next book I finished was The Empire of Gold, and I love the Daevabad trilogy. It's one of my favorite things that I read this year, and the ending was just as good as the rest of the series. I still think the second book is probably my favorite out of all of them, but this was still a 5-star read for me. And I can't talk about too much of it because it's the third book in a trilogy, but I will say that I really loved that it had sort of followed a similar structure to the first book, and that allowed us to compare, contrast these characters and how they've grown, and in some cases how they haven't grown. And I really liked how she did that. I think the strength of this series was the complex characterization that she used. The characters really struggle with choice and intent, and she plays with those things really well through this story, where characters might have the purest intent, but it doesn't prevent them from having really horrible consequences, even if they jump into something thinking this is, the morally good thing to do, and then maybe something horrible happens as a result of it because they were so fixed on an idea of one thing being morally right that they assume that if they're morally, justified, that nothing bad can happen. So I really love that aspect of this series, how she just continually plays with choice, intent, and consequence. And I think that continued here. These characters are just, it's 700 pages of reading terrible things happening to all of your favorites, and half the time it's their own fault. And so you get this sort of oh no, I want you to make good choices, but they don't, and then you just have to watch them suffer. And it's just really well done. I really liked the ending. I thought it was a fitting ending to this series, and I highly recommend the Daevabad trilogy if you haven't read it. I think it's a great trilogy to transition from YA to adult fantasy, because the first book does have the main character a little bit younger and has some more YA vibes, and then there's a pretty large time jump between the first and the second book, and then the second and third are definitely adult issues, adult problems. The politics are way more complex, and I feel like it does a good job of transitioning a reader who is used to a more YA plot into something that is more complex and more adult, mature in theme. So definitely check this out if you haven't already. It's one of my new all-time favorite fantasies. The second book I read was very different. It was Black Girl Unlimited by Echo Brown, and I gave this a 4.5 out of 5 stars. This is a memoir meets magic realism about the author's own life, and she's actually from Cleveland, so she's a local author for me, and she uses the concept of her being a wizard to frame how she copes with poverty, racism, sexual assault, trauma, drug use, grief. I mean, there's so many trigger warnings in this book, but she uses the framing device of being a wizard for basically how she copes in some ways, you know, whether she's dissociating from her body. It's called floating on the ceiling, different things where there's not actually magic. She doesn't actually think she's a wizard. Like, the author doesn't actually think she's a wizard, but in the book, it is used as a framing device to cope with these really traumatic things that she actually went through as a child. And it definitely packed an emotional punch. It was absolutely devastating. I do think it was marketed. When I picked it up, I thought it was going to have more magic realism elements. It's definitely a weird book. If you're someone that likes really weird stuff, you'll like this. You know, heavy, hard-hitting, weird books. This is definitely in that weird category. It was really beautiful. There were a few scenes, especially when the magic kind of ramped up, where I found myself confused or lost about what was going on, which is why it was a 4.5 and not a 5, but I did tear up at the end. It was such a powerful book, and I would highly recommend you read it, keeping in mind that it does handle a lot of very heavy, traumatic things. There is hope at the end, and obviously it's a memoir. The author is writing about her own life, so you know that she makes it out, but it was just really, really powerful, and I would highly recommend the audiobook if you are interested in picking this up. It's narrated by the author, and she just does a wonderful job. And then at the end, when she read her author's the thank you, that was what choked me up the most, because I think she, if I'm recalling correctly, it's been, a few months since I read this, but I think she kind of got choked up while she was reading the thank yous to different people in her life, the dedications, that sort of thing. And it was very emotional because it was the author reading it. And then the final book that I read this month, apparently I just read books about trauma, not this month, this week, oh my goodness gracious, was Burn Our Bodies Down by Rory Power. And I had an advanced copy of this. I don't know if I mentioned, but my copy of Empire of Gold was also an advanced copy. This book was just... it was good. I actually had the opposite feelings about this that I had about Wilder Girls, in that I felt like Wilder Girls was awesome throughout and I loved it. And then the ending was just terrible and it tanked the book for me. Whereas this book, I felt really bored throughout. I thought the beginning was good and the ending was good. And then the middle just felt really pointless. And this definitely had a satisfying ending. If what bothered you about Wilder Girls was it not having a satisfying or complete ending, I think you would like this. It definitely has her writing style. I flew through this in one sitting. It's very, very short and it's an easy read. It's compelling. I didn't feel like I needed to put it down, but I just didn't love the middle, I guess. Once I got done, the ending was really gory and grim, but it didn't have that kind of haunting sense of dread that you expect building up throughout a horror book. And I found the reveal to be really predictable. Like, I guessed it very early on in the book. It wasn't a mystery to me, but this is supposed to be kind of an atmospheric, eerie horror novel that deals with intergenerational and inherited trauma, if that makes sense. And it definitely examines toxic family dynamics, abuse, gaslighting, parental neglect. There's not great family mother-daughter relationships here. And I definitely think it handles those topics very, very well. And it handles them in a way I haven't seen a lot of YA books handle those things. And, you know, despite how well she portrayed these really fraught, toxic, abusive family relationships, I just didn't love it, because at the end of the day, this is supposed to be a horror novel, and obviously horror and fantasy can be used to tackle tougher topics, but I just don't feel like the horror aspects of this book, or even like the spooky, atmospheric kind of stuff, ended up being super successful, especially throughout the middle of the book. It just was like a girl in a cornfield. It wasn't very spooky. So, the ending, satisfying, like I said. If that was your issue with Wilder Girls, I don't think you'll have that issue with this book, but I need the spookiness throughout and the satisfying ending for me to really like a book. So I'll definitely keep reading Rory Power. Her writing is compelling enough and easy to read, and I feel like eventually she will write a book that I'm really going to love. So I'm going to keep reading until we get there. So that was everything I read this week. In terms of what actually happened in my real life, real quick, this was the first week I went back to work, which also probably contributed to my reading slump. But, you know, it happens. We were closed to the public for about a month, so I was able to listen to audiobooks at work, which is pretty much the only reading I did during July for the most part, because I just, you know, was really not having it. I did not want to be at work, and there was a lot going on. This was right before I went into a lupus flare, and I could tell, I think in the next week or two, you'll see I started having pretty bad lupus symptoms again, and I think the stress of going back to work and everything in the middle of a pandemic was just a lot. So this was the finished spread. This was very, very sparkly, and I really love all the silver foil and how it turned out, and I'm so glad I finally got to use this kit. I love this artwork. I had actually debated not going back and back planning the summer, but this kit convinced me I needed to, because I've been sitting on it for almost 2 years at this point. I was like, I really want to just use this kit because she's pretty. I love this artwork by Kittenish Jess. So thank you guys so much for watching this video. I hope you enjoyed, and I will talk to you in my next one. Bye, guys.